Welcome to the Newsa-Cast YouTube channel. These Red Smith Banquet throwbacks are exclusive interviews of sports legends, powerful media personalities, and influential coaches. You won't find these anywhere else. Subscribe below and enjoy.
All right, Newsa-Cast listeners, welcome to the throwback. When we bring you some content from the Red Smith Sports Awards, and we're going all the way back to 2008. Doesn't seem that long ago, but we had a legendary sports writer at the show, Frank Deford, who, well, first of all, he was born December 16th. That's a very good date, by the way. If you know what I mean. Great day. He died in 2017 in Key West, Florida, but he's like one of the all-time greats, Joe.
Yeah, he really is. I mean, he's incredible. I mean, Sports Illustrated. So we have back-to-back Sports Illustrated journalists have been incredible. Jill Lieber last week from Neenah, Wisconsin. But Frank Deford is, I know journalists aren't necessarily well known, but you're certainly going to know who this guy is when you hear him speak. I mean, he was on the Sunday shows. He was on NPR, that kind of stuff. His speech is probably maybe the most brilliant speech that has ever been given at Red Smith. Certainly the most well thought out. The guy is just next level. I don't even know how to describe him. Yeah,
he wrote for Sports Illustrated from 1962 until his death in 2017. Right. He was on NPR's morning edition radio program from 1980 to 2017. He was a regular sports commentator there. He was 6 times voted National Sports Writer of the Year, and twice voted Magazine Writer of the Year by the Washington Journalism Review. So he's got the chops for sure, and pretty incredible. He actually in 2012, Joe, he became the first magazine recipient of the Red Smith Award, which goes to journalists from the journalism side. Different. I know it's different, but
Walter Red Smith. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So
who actually came to the banquet? I don't have my little chart in front of me, but it was in the 70s sometime. He came and received the I believe he would have received the Nice Guy Award, but
excellent.
Right. Yeah. 2 Red Smiths.
Yeah, I think you guys are going to enjoy this. I mean, when you hear him speak, you understand the 18 books that he wrote and the novels and everything else, and just the intelligence and just the passion that comes through. It's pretty fantastic.
Absolutely. Enjoy.
Introducing tonight's featured speaker, Frank Deford. For someone in my position as sports editor of the Post-Crescent, is like a brush with royalty. There is no bridge in sports journalism Deford hasn't built, crossed, and one that eventually stood the test of time. He has written 15 books. 2 of his novels have been turned into movies. He has recorded more than 1,000 weekly commentaries for National Public Radio. He has worked on TV with CNN, HBO, and NBC, while winning an Emmy Award for his coverage of the 1988 Olympics. In the process of pursuing my sports journalism career, Frank Deford is etched in my mind for 2 things: as editor-in-chief of the National Sports Daily and his lengthy career with Sports Illustrated. In 1990, the National was an idea ahead of its time that couldn't overcome distribution problems in its 18-month run. It had the country's best writers and innovative ways of breaking down sports numbers. It was a print version of what people see today with websites like CNNSI and ESPN.com. A large part of Deford's writing career was at Sports Illustrated from 1962 to 1989. It was because of his work there that led GQ magazine to call him the world's greatest sports writer. Sports Illustrated senior writer Jack McCallum, who people here may remember as the author of the hometown story about Appleton in 1986, recognizes Deford's style. I think Frank invented the long feature that really got at somebody that was neither a rip job nor an overly positive public relations piece, McCallum says. Deford says he tries to find stories that touch the human nerve and even sometimes make you cry. Deford did that with his memoir, Alex, The Life of a Child, written about his daughter who died of cystic fibrosis at the age of 8 in 1980. When I mentioned to my boss, Post-Crescent executive editor Dan Flannery, that Deford was tonight's guest speaker, he immediately said, "Have you read the book about his daughter? If you haven't, get it, read it." I blubbered the whole way through. And if you know anything about Dan, with his gruff exterior, that's saying something. Deford's ties to Wisconsin are limited. His biggest connection with the state was spending time in Milwaukee as part of the Miller Lite All-Stars in the Taste Great, Less Filling ad campaign in the 1980s. Deford's all-time favorite interview was state icon Al McGuire. Here are a few of Deford's favorite sayings from the former Marquette basketball coach. "Every obnoxious fan has a wife at home who dominates him." "I think the world is run by C students," with Deford writing that Al said that way before he'd ever heard of George W. Bush. And Deford's favorite, "When you bring flowers home to your wife and say there's no reason, there's a reason." In one of his national public radio commentaries, Deford spoke of a passion which Packers fans can relate. "For all that we endure in an impersonal, transient, capricious global society where people live multitask lives with multi-moves, multi-marriages, multi-crises, multi-golf swings, the one thing I think that can still mark a man as trustworthy and dependable is that at least he sticks forever with the sports teams of his youth, his true first loves." ESPN once presented a television biography of Deford's life and work entitled, "You Write Better Than You Play." Though his athletic career may be average, Deford's legacy is legendary. His astute observations have been challenging readers, listeners, and viewers while giving them a unique perspective into the sports world for decades. And it's my privilege to introduce to you tonight's Red Smith Award Banquet main speaker, Frank Deford.
I appreciate those kind words, Brad, but I must say that's not necessarily universal in the field. Many of you may have heard of a basketball coach, best known for his antics down in Indiana, now bivouacs somewhere out in West Texas, Bobby Knight. And Bobby once said, "The best time in every sports writer's life were the 3 years he spent in second grade." Now, if that's not bad enough, being a sports writer, I must admit that I come to you from the island of Manhattan. That's right, home of the hated and despised New York Giants. But I must also tell you that they are up for the game, Mark. All of New York. This is this morning's edition of the New York Post with Britney Spears on the cover and Brett Favre on the back. The Post is a paper of great discretion and understated, of course. And just for the record, in large type, it calls the town of Green Bay hell. I don't think they've ever gone that far ever before. Mark, I present this to you. You can take it back to Hades with you. And you can read about Britney Spears if you want. But you know, there's no doubt in my mind that I picked the right time to be a sports writer. And don't think for a minute that America is an especially sports-minded country. Believe me, sports is the human condition. Wherever I've been in the world, doesn't make any difference. Indiana, India, Indonesia, the two things that I always hear people say, or anyway men say, is number one, we have the best-looking women in the world right here. And number two, we have the best sports fans. Not the best athletes, because of course that can be resolved on the field of play, but we love sports more than anything else. What a point of pride, universal. What's the worst thing I could say about Appleton? You're a bad sports town. Oh my God, that's a dagger through people's heart. I could call you a bad education town, a bad crime town, water off the back, but a bad sports town. Why, I would say that right now, to most men, sports is even more important than sex. Certainly this is true with golfers. Now, I don't play golf myself, which always astonishes people. A sports writer who doesn't play golf, it's as if I said I didn't choose to use indoor plumbing. But I was lucky. I came into sports before athletes had so much money, Bob, that they still needed us writers a little bit. Frank, give me some ink. I need some ink. So we could be friends, players and writers. Now, I don't mean it was a sweetheart deal. The players tested you. First story I ever did for Sports Illustrated, they sent me out to be with the Los Angeles Lakers, who then as now were one of the preeminent franchises. I was scared to death. I was supposed to meet the team in the hotel lobby that morning. We were going to fly to the next city. I think I put both Brill Cream and Vitalis on my hair, trying to slick it down. I put on my brand new, snappy, checked sport jacket, put on a pair of horn-rimmed glasses in a vain effort to make myself look just a little bit older, and came downstairs and hoped not to be noticed. And Elgin Baylor spotted me right away. Now, most people have forgotten Elgin, which is a mistake. Let me tell you, he was Michael Jordan before there was a Michael Jordan. But he wasn't just a great player. He was also the team leader, and he was also the funniest guy on the team. And looking over at me in a loud voice, he said, "I didn't know Ralston Purina was making sports jackets these days." That was my welcome to the big leagues. I did feel a little bit better when I found out that the only other writer traveling with the team, a guy from the Los Angeles Times, had bad teeth, and they called him Low Tide at Santa Monica. You know, we think of sports as parochial, but the fact of the matter is that I've covered stories in 40 different countries, on all continents but Antarctica, and I don't want to go there anyhow. I lived with Arthur Ashe when he broke the color line in South Africa, which was really the first dent in apartheid. But as Brad suggested, the best interview I ever had was right here in Wisconsin with Al McGuire. He's the only person in my life I've ever met who would put your name at the beginning and the end of a sentence both. Frank, you want to go to lunch, Frank? And after a while, drives you crazy. And I would start doing it myself. Al, yeah, let's go to lunch, Al. And everybody talks about how Al was hell on wheels on his motorcycle. But the fact of the matter is, he was the worst slow automobile driver I have ever been with in my life. When Al was talking, he would sort of forget everything, and he would just stop at the red light and stay there and talk, and sometimes he would even let the car kind of drift to a stop. And I would say, Al, you got to move, Al. And I had to stop interviewing him in the car. It was dangerous going so slow. And like Al, the people that I've liked best in sports are the unaffected ones. I mean, we hold athletes up to be our heroes, don't we? And a lot of them, it goes to their heads. Now, a lot of people think athletes shouldn't be our role models, right? You remember Charles Barkley's famous commercial for Nike? And he said, well, don't make anything of me. Look up to your fathers and your preachers and your teachers. Now, of course, you got to take everything my friend Sir Charles says with a grain of salt. I mean, He was the guy who claims he was misquoted in his own autobiography. But I do think it's okay for children to look up to athletes. They're going to do that anyway with rock stars and those fools on American Idol. They might as well look up to athletes too. But I get a little suspicious of adults who continue to make heroes out of athletes. And boy, did I learn the hard way. I went down to Alabama to do a story on Bear Bryant. He was going to set the record for most wins. It was a real big deal. If you remember, the people in Alabama at that time said that the bear walked on water. And they winked when they said that, but I think in their heart of hearts, they really believed it. And I get down there and I find not this icon, but a worn-out old man. And he was the first to admit it. He said, "Oh, Frank, I shouldn't be coaching. I'm just, my assistants are doing all the work. I'm just going for this fool record." And like a lot of old men, and I'm sorry I have to be a little indelicate here, the bear had a problem. He had to go to the bathroom all the time. Now, it's not like I was a great investigative reporter to discover this. The bear either did it all the time or talked about it all the time. And so, in an article of, 5,000 or 6,000 words, in one paragraph in passing, I mentioned it. And it was a firestorm in the state of Alabama. The mail poured in to Sports Illustrated, all of it hateful. One petition, 800 names, sent to my managing editor demanding that I be fired. And most appropriately, it was written on toilet paper. Best of all was a letter I got from a Methodist minister, and I must say, he wrote it on church stationery. The Reverend so-and-so, such and such Methodist Church, so-and-so Alabama. It was very direct and to the point. "Dear Mr. Deford," it said, "whenever your parents would like to get married, I would be delighted to perform the ceremony." Don't mess with sports heroes. Actually, us writers are always accused too. People always say, "How can you write about sports if you've never played the game? How can you do it?" And it would be sinful of me to be at the Red Smith dinner without citing the other famous Red Smith from up in Green Bay, who was the great columnist. I think Red Smith was the greatest columnist, not just sports columnist of all time. And somebody said that to Red, and he was a little guy. He was no athlete at all. Somebody said that one time to Red, "How can you write about the game if you never played it?" And Red said, "If that were true, then only dead men could write obituaries." But I hold one distinction, I've thought, as a sports writer. I'm the last writer, the last print journalist on the face of the earth who was actually chosen over television. This was back in the 60s, and the Celtics, as usual, were playing the Lakers in the NBA Finals. It's hard to believe now, but none of these games are on television. And finally, one of the networks agreed to pick up the Sunday afternoon game, and that turned out to be the final game of the series. The Celtics, as usual, won, and Auerbach. Red was really the first taunter, the first trash talker. He's the grandfather of that. He takes out the cigar, and the game ends, and I rush over to be with him and to walk off the court. And this little guy runs up to him and says, Red, they want you up in the interview booth." And Auerbach looks down at him. I'll spare you the vulgarity here. And he just says, "Where were you in February?" The little guy is baffled. And Auerbach looks at him again. He said, "I said, where the bleep were you in February?" And he throws his arm around my shoulder, and he says, with the cigar like this, "I'm going with my writers. I was never so proud of being a sports writer." Of course. Of course, it's been 40 years since then without anything that good. But I'm so delighted to be with you this evening. I have heard so much, believe it or not, I have heard so much about the Red Smith Award dinner and how extraordinary it is. And boy, you sure have lived up to everything that I have heard. And I'm just so pleased that all you're doing for team sports, for athletics, and I think especially being on teams is so important. We always celebrate the individual, the cowboy, the lone wolf. But those are our romantic heroes. But for some reason, I don't think we pay sufficient homage to our natural penchant for coming together and working together. It's part of our heritage as Americans, how many clubs and organizations we belong to it, and how many of us do indeed grow up being members of teams and learning how to work together that way. Maybe it's just our way of compensating for being such a transient and heterogeneous culture. I don't think it's any coincidence that whereas in most countries there's only one sport that kids play, soccer, here 4 or 5. Baseball, basketball, football, soccer, hockey in a lot of places. We learn to do things together that way on teams. The famous British novel about school, Mr. Chips, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, was about a Latin teacher. I think if anybody wrote an American Mr. Chips, he would be a coach. He'd be a basketball coach or a football coach. The team, I always think of that wonderful quote by Tommy Lasorda, the former manager of the Dodgers. He said, "Managing a baseball club is like holding a dove in your hands. Too tight, you squeeze it to death. Too loose, it flies away." It's wonderful imagery. It's exceeded only perhaps better by what Casey Stengel said. Casey said, "The secret of managing is to keep the 5 guys who hate you away from the 5 who haven't made up their minds." American boys anyway, have always known what it was like to be that dove in Tommy Lasorda's hands. We always call it teamwork, but primarily what I really think it is team care. It's just that probably caring sounds too sissy to boys, but it is. You do learn to care about each other when you're on a team, and not only that learned behavior carries over into our adult lives and into our businesses. So what any of you are doing carries well beyond the field. And then I'll never forget a few years ago chatting with Billie Jean King, who I think after Jackie Robinson is the single most important cultural sports figure in American sport. And she told me, actually with tears in her eyes, that one of the great regrets in her life is that she never got to be on a team growing up, because back then schools did not have teams for girls. That's probably hard for Heidi and Tricia and Maddie to understand, but it was so. That now that girls have the same chances as boys, look out, guys, because they are smarter than us. And now that they have that added advantage of growing up on teams, just like we always had, it's going to be even tougher for us. You know, sports are great, and we all agree on that. But sometimes I do fear that we concentrate with boys too much on athletics. You know that it won't be long now, if things continue in the same way, and there's no reason to think they won't, that 2/3 of all the college students in this country will be female. And that's not good for this country. I know this is a sports dinner and we're celebrating athletics, but I think that's the very reason I should bring that up here. It doesn't do any good just to preach to the choir. All of us, starting with myself, who love sports so, we've got to make sure that our boys lead balanced lives with sports and academics together. Of course, women still haven't caught up with us in one regard, as sports spectators. Figure skating is the only sport that women watch on television more than men. You know, the women just don't seem to have that finger-clicking gene like we do. As we sit numbly on the couch, switching back and forth between rodeo and NASCAR and poker. Or maybe it's more like a wise woman friend of mine once told me. She said, Frank, men don't want to know what's on television. They want to know what else is on television. But speaking of teams, and Brad made reference to this, I too was on that national championship team. I was on the Light Beer All-Stars. Remember? Tastes great, less filling. I was invited to be the Sportswriter All-Star. And I was a little nervous. I made a commercial, first of all, with Billy Martin and Marv Throneberry. And then I was invited for what was called the alumni commercial, in which we would all get together. And I was a little nervous because I'd written about some of these guys, and not all together kindly. But I found out very quickly that they didn't care if the devil himself was in their midst, as long as you didn't do one thing, and that was blow your lines. Because if you did that, we had to stay out shooting the full commercial, and we couldn't go back to the hotel and drink light beer. So the one guy who had the most trouble with his lines eternally was Bubba Smith. Remember Bubba, big, tall defensive lineman for Michigan State and the Baltimore Colts. Bubba was so bad with his lines that one time the line he blew was his own name. I think that's a first in the theater. But even better, he was shooting a commercial one time with Dick Butkus. Butkus told me this story. And the thrust of the commercial was that golf was a more difficult game than football. And the key line that Bubba was supposed to deliver as they walked down the fairway was, yeah, it's a lot easier hitting a quarterback than a little white ball. Only time and time again, what Bubba said was, yeah, it's a lot easier hitting a little white quarterback. Mike Reese asked me to, what Brad made reference to say a few words about cystic fibrosis. I was the chairman of the foundation, and sadly, I did have a daughter, Alexandra, who died of the disease when she was only 8. Now, this is entirely too happy an occasion to dwell on that, but there was one thing that she said that stays with me, and it's particularly appropriate at a time like this. It's sort of ironic, but as a sports writer, I've spent so much of my life around the people who are the most blessed physically. But it was someone who was denied even the basics of a healthy body who made the greatest impression on me. On her last Christmas morning, which was a very happy day, even as sick as she was. In fact, she would be dead in another 3 weeks. Alex turned to my wife at one point and she said, "Oh, Mom, if only I could be free of cystic fibrosis for just one day, just to be free for one day." And here was the wisdom of a child, because I don't think that most of us think of good health as a freedom, do we? We if we have it, we just tend to accept it. But it is, of course, the largest freedom of all, because without it, you can't enjoy any of the others. So, particularly for those young athletes of you who are being honored tonight, just keep that in mind and don't worry too much about winning and losing and being a big star. Just be grateful that you have that freedom to play sports. And not only that, be glad that you can play and that you have so many people like all those here tonight who support you in allowing you to enjoy what you love to do so very, very much. Now, Yogi Berra, I had lunch with Yogi a little while. He's still an American treasure. And what would be a sports writer's speech without a citation to Yogi? Yogi and Phil Rizzuto several years ago were on their way to a dinner in New Jersey, and they were tooling happily down the road, and Rizzuto got a little nervous, and he said, "Yogi, I think we're lost." And Yogi said, "Yeah, but we're making such good time." And with that as my scripture, we are making such good time. I'm going to stop now, but thank you so very much for having me. It's been a wonderful evening, and I've so enjoyed being here in Appleton with you.
Please subscribe to this channel, give this video a thumbs up, and hit that notification bell so you get notified when we post another great episode or interview. Download the podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for your support.